All right, well, we're going to get started. We appreciate y'all joining. Again, this is the Office of State Procurement. Jonathan Walker, the outgoing Assistant Director for Policy. Also on the call, leading the webinar today is Austin Bachman, the new Assistant Director for Policy in the Office of State Procurement, and Zelinsky Matthew, the new Assistant Director for Analytics in the Office of State Procurement. We're glad to be discussing with y'all, giving a procurement overview for legislative and budget staff. On the call, we have subject matter experts from House Fiscal, Legislative Fiscal Office, Senate Fiscal, and OPB here in the division, as well as, of course, some of our subject matter experts in the Office of State Procurement. So glad to share an overview of procurement and also take questions, since we know this can be a recurring topic of interest to legislators and the public they represent. So we'll get right into it. I will be recording the session, so it's available for posterity. Y'all can reference against it. And again, since I won't be carrying the ball in the future, I'm happy to volunteer that Austin and Zelinsky will be available to host this presentation in the future. I hope they won't mind me volunteering them for that. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the recording, and we'll get into the presentation. Oh, already recording. All right, let's get going. So today, an agenda, we're going to talk about the Office of State Procurement and the Chief Procurement Officer, the CPO, an overview of applicable procurement laws, authorized procurement methods, state systems and registration, strategies for vendor success, outreach, inclusion, and accountability initiatives that have been put in place. I'll pause here to note that you'll notice that some of the content is tailored towards a vendor audience. That's intentional, because likely what y'all most often get questions about is how to do business with the state, or a vendor has reached out to one of your members, or a vendor has reached out to a state agency and is either proposing something or questioning something, or has a specific idea in mind. It's typically vendor initiated. So we share some of the same content that we would give them in terms of how to best position themselves to do business with the state, because much of the content we give them is the same content we would give you in terms of these are the methods, these are the ways the state procures. We'll also give an overview of resources applicable, as well as a robust question and answer session. Please feel free to take notes as you go. Again, since it's recorded, you'll have a copy of this. At the same time, you should also feel free to ask any questions so we can not just benefit those who are listening, but anybody else down the road who may have the same questions.
So the Office of State Procurement, our mission is essentially to foster competition, have open, fair procurement in accordance with our executive policies and our legislative mandates. But we also go further with that, and our goal is to provide quality customer service to all of our agencies and vendors. Okay, so I guess you could say our motto there would be full, fair, and fast. All right, so with the customer service, while that is one of our goals, we also have to balance it with our role as a regulatory reviewer. And of course, our director is Paula Trade, the State Chief Procurement Officer.
The Office of State Procurement is an ancillary unit within the Division of Administration, agency number 820. We are classified as an internal service fund agency per federal rules. We operate our allocation through the statewide cost allocation plan, which is simplified by a customer agency's percent of OSP's workload will be allocated based on the percentage, based on that percentage of the previous year upon our IAT revenues for the following year. Approximately 60% of our revenue comes from fees and self-generated, while the remaining 40% is IAT, which there is a continuing shift from IAT to self-generated. The Office of State Procurement came about through the centralization of the statewide procurement process. Statewide procurement staff were rolled up into the division. The merger between the Office of State Procurement and Office of Contractor Review also combined into the Office of State Procurement.
We mentioned this, some of y'all may have been familiar previously with the Office of State Purchasing or the Office of Contractual Review. Of course, at the same time that those functions were joined together, state agency staff were combined. So you hear those two terms used interchangeably, but we definitely like to give background since we know it's been several years since there has been a procurement training like this. So one of the questions we get most often is about the intersection of various procurement laws. That, of course, is of particular relevance to this group. There are 5 major procurement codes. When I started in the Office of State Procurement 7 years ago, I would have told you that there were 3. Now there are 5, and for the reasons you'll see. Number 1 is perhaps the procurement code most familiar to this audience, the public bid law, what we call Title 38. It governs almost all procurements of goods and services by political subdivisions, as well as major construction by facility planning and state agencies. It is not, however, the procurement code used by OSP or state agencies for goods and services, technical services, or professional services. Next up, we have the IT procurement code, which, while it's in Title 39, is technically distinct from the main procurement code that we use. The IT procurement code, of course, is for IT. It's carried by OTS. They have authority to govern the procurement of hardware, software, and related goods and services. And again, it's split out from main Title 39, which is governed by OSP, enforced by OSP. Of course, OSP is the main user of it as well. So all procurements other than construction and IT by state agencies go through Title 39, and that's going to be the focus of today's presentation. The 2 other codes that are out there are Title 48, which is strictly for DOTD highway construction. Anything that's going to become part of a highway is subject to Title 48 rather than Title 39. And the LSU Pilot Procurement Code. This is probably something y'all are familiar with. LSU has autonomy to engage in its own procurements. It can use state contracts, and it does use quite a number of state contracts, but it can initiate its own procurements, and it does. This is something that may be of continuing relevance because last year the legislature authorized additional institutions to sign on to the Pilot Procurement Code, which has not yet happened, but to the extent that it does, you'll see further complexity in this procurement law space. But again, this is just an overview. Today's presentation is going to be focusing on the procurement code number 3 here, Title 39. Going to give a brief survey of the relevant statutes within the procurement code. So this is all 39. So 39-1552 articulates the underlying purposes and policies of the procurement code, which notably it talks about simplifying, making procurements more efficient, in all cases maximizing competition. The goal of the procurement code, it's not a brass tack, save money. It is maximize transparency, maximize competition, maximize clarity for everybody engaged in it. And of course, I'm summarizing each of these. 1554 gets into applications and exceptions. So for example, it says that a procurement which has been initiated by a political subdivision in accordance with Title 38 is of course exempted from Title 39. Definitions. Definitions is a more robust chapter than many equivalent sections, however, because definitions can actually define an entire category. The definition of professional services, for example, is hugely monumental because as we're going to get into, the competition requirements for professional services are vastly different than they are for consulting services. Although to a layperson, they may seem quite similar. The definitions becomes key, and 1556 is one of the top used ones. 1561 gets into the authority of the Commissioner of Administration. 1562 is the creation of OSP and the State Chief Procurement Officer. I like to look at 1561 and 1562 in concert. The commissioner has broad authority. If you want to think about it in terms of, he sets the outer parameters of procurement law or procurement governance. He can issue procurement regulations affecting the entire state. And then the chief procurement officer is, of course, authorized to do everything within the broad boundaries that have been set by the commissioner. 1563 creates the authority for Austin, Zielinski, and I. 1563 creates the authority of the commissioner to delegate to assistants and to agencies. This is where we get into the concept of delegated procurement authority. So both agencies and individuals can have authority that emanates, if you will, from the chief procurement officer down to her assistants and to the agencies. 1564 articulates that the chief procurement officer, the director of OSP, has the authority to make and supervise all procurements. 1567, 69, and 1590 are reporting requirements. One of the recurring themes that comes up for procurement, especially for those of you who've been around the legislature or the legislative process for, I'd say, 6 years or more, will be familiar with, is the idea of reporting requirements, having a good handle on how many contracts we have, what the content of those requirements is, what the propriety of those contracts are. So I like to point out these reporting requirements as existing requirements, and we're going to share some of those accountability resources as well later on. 1572 builds on exceptions that were in 1554 to notably say that higher education has limited exemption from the Title 39 Procurement Code. 1593 through 1600 get into methods, which we're going to talk about in much greater detail shortly. So I'll skip over that for now. 1602 through 1602.1 get into vendor exclusions. This was a hot topic during this past legislative session. I believe it was Representative Miguez had a bill which would have prohibited companies which discriminate against firearms companies from being awarded state contracts. That ultimately was not enacted, but it would have gone into this particular statute next to the prohibition on, or the right to refuse bids from communist countries and the prohibition on doing business with companies who are involved in a boycott, divestment, or sanctions against the nation of Israel. 1604 is preferences. This is a hot topic. It comes up every once in a while where a company will, say that we're Louisiana-based. We think we should have a leg up compared to, a company located out of the country or out of the state. And in some limited cases, they do have that ability to obtain a preference. 1604 through 1604.8, I believe, articulate the range and the applicability of those preferences. Going through a couple more provisions, and again, this is just the foundation for what we're going to talk about later, giving this to you as a reference. 1615 talks about multi-year contracts. This is a hot topic because, of course, agencies, once they've gone through the work of establishing a contract, would prefer to have a long contract. The legislature, of course, with its oversight role, generally prefers shorter contracts because it maximizes the ability of the legislature to be aware of what's going on and have oversight. 1617 through 1621 define the professional, personal, consulting, and social service contract types. We call them the PPCS services, which are most typically the focus of legislative oversight. So although we have many thousands of other contracts for purchasing stuff or obtaining technical services like landscaping or security guard services, most of the time when people talk about contracts, they're talking about one of these four types: professional, personal, consulting, and social service. And we'll get into that shortly. 1622 is performance-based energy efficiency contracts. 1623 through 1626 get into the extensive requirements that go into contract approvals. This is where I would point a member who wants to know how much due diligence goes into the contract review process. Do we approve everything that crosses our desk, or do we have, you know, a framework for making sure that the contract appears reasonable, that it's budgeted, and that it's in line with the agency's mission. 1661 through the end of the 1600s, that starts to get into controversies, modifications, terminations, vendor actions, debarments, suspensions, protests, and appeals. 1676 through 1679 are procedures and penalties for violations. 1679 is an interesting little statute. It actually has a criminal penalty built into it, and it says that anybody who knowingly violates the state procurement code is subject to a fine of not more than $1,000, nor more than a brief, I think it's a 6-month stint in jail. So the procurement code actually has a criminal code built into it, and that's what I would refer to if there's ever a question about what happens if you have a flagrantly bad actor, you know, somebody who knowingly defrauds the state or somebody who knowingly disregards their contractual terms. 1702 through 1709 get into cooperative purchasing, which we're going to come up shortly. 1731 through 1736 is another hot topic. This is preferences and set-asides that are already included in the state procurement code for disadvantaged and women-owned businesses. The Louisiana Supreme Court struck down these provisions. They're still in the procurement code. I believe they're on the list of the unconstitutional statutes. Just wanted to bring it to your attention because this is something that's talked about as something the state might consider doing in the future, like a DBE or a WBE procurement preference. In fact, it already exists, but it's unusable. 1751 through 1755 gets into telecommunications, and then there's other sundry provisions that talk about acquisition of space and leasing of property and equipment, but we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on the core meat of the purchasing of stuff, technical services, and then the professional, personal, consulting, and social services that we talked about before.
The methods of procurement, the methods and complexities are tailored by the dollar value, starting with small purchases, which are done through executive order of fiscal year 2017-18. Purchases of 0 to 10,000, there's no competition required. They can be done through informal quotes or P-card purchases. 10,000 to 20,000, 3 quotes are required, or the Hudson Initiative, which is the certification program designed to help small businesses gain access to contracting and purchases through the state. And then next would be the $20,000 to $30,000 purchases, which 5 quotes are required. And then we have competitive sealed bids, which are also known as ITBs, which are purchases over $30,000 that must be publicly advertised. And finally, we have the request for proposals, also known as RFPs.
So we'll get into deeper dive into RFPs because these are often high profile, often things that legislators are interested in. Okay. So we'll start with a comparison between the RFP and the invitation to bid. An RFP is going to be used when you're seeking a solution to a problem. So you have a problem as an agency, you don't necessarily know what the best way to solve it is. On the other hand, the invitation to bid, you know what you need and you're just going out to market to purchase that on a low-cost basis. With the RFPs, you're receiving proposals. They're reviewed by an evaluation committee, and we're awarding to the most advantageous proposal, which takes into account cost and other factors, which we generally refer to as technical evaluation. On the other hand, with the ITBs, it's state procurement analyst in our office. There's no committee, and you're making your award to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. So that's the the lowest offered price that meets the specifications, so they're meeting exactly what we're asking for, and their company is also responsible. They have the resources to be able to perform the contract. With the RFP, we can also negotiate within those when we get to the contract. We do have some mandatory requirements and non-negotiable terms and conditions that are embedded in our RFPs, but everything else can be negotiated. With the ITB, there's no negotiation. The terms and conditions are required, and we're really just looking at the cost that comes in. So with our RFPs, we have a written contract there, signed by both parties, negotiated and signed by both parties, approved by state procurement. With an ITB, those usually end up in a purchase order, or occasionally a 44 contract that we'll see later, exactly kind of what those are. So when we get into RFPs, they're authorized by Section 39-1595. It is intentionally written to be fairly broad. There's just limited things that are required in an RFP. And then the RFP itself is almost like a governing document. So how you write your RFP governs how your procurement has to go. 1595 really kind of gives you a starting point and an end point, and everything in the middle is up to best practices and rules and regulations that are created by state procurement. So in an RFP, you're trying to balance the cost with other factors. Easy way to think about this is essentially everyday shopping that you do in your personal life. You don't necessarily go out and get just the cheapest thing that's available. Sometimes quality comes into play, and so you're balancing those with any purchase you're really making. That's what we're trying to do with an RFP. We're trying to get the best value for taxpayer funds. So within our RFP, we are defining our needs and our desires. We call these desires really our should statements. Needs are going to be your mandatory requirements that you'll see in the document as shall. And the whole kind of purpose and goal, kind of overarching goal, I guess, with an RFP is to build in flexibility so that we can get that best value for the state.
To add something here, one of the useful ways I think of to clarify the difference between an RFP and an ITB is to think in terms of the scenario Austin mentioned of shopping in our personal lives. And I like to use the example of a flashlight. So if we were shopping for a flashlight and we saw two of them on the rack next to each other, we went into the store thinking maybe we need an 8-hour battery life on the flashlight. That's our minimum criteria. When we go look at the flashlights that they have on the rack there, and they have a flashlight with an 8-hour, let's say they have 3 flashlights. One is a flashlight with a 6-hour life. That doesn't meet minimum requirements. We're going to ignore that one. Then they have a flashlight with an 8-hour life for $10. Then let's say that they have a flashlight with a 100-hour battery life for $12. So $2 more, but over 10 times the battery life of the flashlight that barely meets minimum specifications. In the invitation to bid process, anything that meets minimum requirements, we award to the lowest bidder. In the invitation to bid ITB process, we're going to be purchasing that 8-hour flashlight for $10. In the RFP process, the balancing act that Austin is referring to is not necessarily the case that you're going to purchase that third flashlight, the one that I think that we would all buy in our personal lives. I know I personally would spend $2 more for 10 times the battery life. But as Austin's going to articulate, the RFP process lets us have that balancing act to figure out if that battery life, as it were, makes sense for the state whenever it's purchasing Medicaid services or whatever the case may be.
So we'll just introduce you into our RFP process. with the caveat here, for those of you who may be familiar with this, this may look different than what you're used to. This is the process in our new Legis system, which we're implementing agencies into right now. So it's going to start with an agency drafting their scope of work, and that is what they're submitting to state procurement. The scope of work defines their problem, essentially, what they need solved, what service they're looking for. At that point, the agency and state procurement are working together to draft, revise, and then both parties are reviewing the remainder of the RFP documents. So this adds in terms and conditions, the evaluation factors, the sample contract, and other things like that. Once both parties are satisfied with the RFP, it's published. While it's published, suppliers have the opportunity to submit questions that they need answers to get better clarity about what exactly we're looking for in this procurement. Eventually, the RFP opens. That's the deadline to submit proposals. Those proposals then go through an evaluation with an evaluation committee, eventually leading to an award recommendation. The agency negotiates the contract with their awarded proposers with support from state procurement at their option. Once the contract's negotiated, it's submitted to state procurement for statutory approval, and then the contract performance begins. So the evaluation committee, we'll go into a little bit more details about how the evaluation committees work and how evaluations work as a whole. Your evaluation committee is going to be at least 3 subject matter experts. Our guidance is usually 3 to 5, but occasionally it goes more than that. We've had some that go 7, 9, 12 people. Generally, state procurement recommends fewer people just because it makes things less complex. It's already a complicated enough procedure to go through an RFP. Let's not add more complications in than necessary. Okay. Their job as the evaluation committee members is to evaluate the proposals based on what is in the RFP. And they also are only looking at what's included in the proposal. So if they know additional information about somebody who submitted the proposal, they really need to stick to what was in the proposal itself, so you wouldn't consider that information in your evaluation. Ultimately, their job is to select the most advantageous proposal, as we mentioned before. They have several responsibilities as part of the evaluation committee. First one's going to be they need to know what is in the RFP itself, so they need to understand what their agency is looking for, what the goals of the procurement are, what are the mandatory requirements in order to do their evaluation. They also need to understand how the evaluation is going to be structured. This is a combination of the technical scoring, which is where their focus really is, so they need to know what has been decided beforehand will go into that technical scoring. They need to understand the consensus method of evaluation, which is how we generally do things at the state with our evaluations. That is that the committee acts as a whole. It's not individual pieces that we're then averaging each person's scores. The committee has to agree on one score as a committee. We also have adjectival ratings. Essentially, we have gone into various adjectives, such as excellent, good, poor. Terrible is not really one, but that is more colorful for something like this. And we've tied those into a certain percentage of the points that are available. So we may say that an excellent proposal is worth 100% of the points, good is 75%, poor is 25, terrible is 0. Okay, so they need to understand how those work. And then We've already kind of touched on the evaluation criteria. That is, that's what we're looking at when we're doing the technical scoring. It's exactly what we're going to evaluate. It's not necessarily everything we ask for in the proposals. They need to understand that they are to be impartial. Any conflicts of interest need to be identified, and then they would need to recuse themselves from the process. We actually have all of our committee members sign a document that states that they are impartial, that they don't have a conflict of interest, and then also, just a couple bullet points down, but also that they will maintain the confidentiality of the process. Their role is to not compare proposals. They're comparing the proposals against what was asked for in the RFP itself, not comparing proposals to each other in their evaluation. And then we also have a set list of instructions that goes into more detail of these bullets that we've mentioned here. They have to understand those instructions as well. Ooh, those are out of order. Oops. That's what I get for not running through it once, I guess. All right, so when it comes to the evaluation process, the first step in that is to develop this evaluation methodology document. It's essentially a document that governs how we're going to perform our evaluation. And that needs to be completed and approved by state procurement before the evaluation begins. And even before that, it's actually done prior to any committee member receiving a proposal. We try to get this done and approved while the RFP is still published, so before the deadline for response. Doesn't always happen, but that's the goal. In any case, we hold off on sending the agency the proposals until we have that in place. The first step for the actual evaluation itself is going to be individual review by the committee members. We want them to truly do this individually so that there's no bias from any source coming in. We want their idea of what or how the proposal performed as single members. Once they've all the members have had an opportunity to do that individual review, we convene a consensus scoring meeting. This is where we finalize the evaluation. The committee members discuss their thoughts for each of those evaluation factors and criteria. They document the strengths and weaknesses of each proposal, and then they're also assigning points as a committee to those. Usually fairly in-depth meetings. We've had some where it's really just a series of meetings that can take, sometimes weeks, depending on how complex the RFP was and how many proposals were received. Following the consensus meeting, we can go straight to an award. This is also following that you may have oral presentations where we're bringing in proposers to give us additional details about what, or clarify what was in their proposals. They could also give a demo of whatever they're offering. We can also go to a best and final offer here, where we're essentially, I was going to say you can to try to get a better price, but that's really not the best practice for your best and final offer. Really, we're using this as like a corrective mechanism. If we realize something wasn't quite right, maybe we realized some proposers had a misunderstanding about what we were asking for in our scope of work, we can use a best and final offer to get revised proposals and kind of clear up any inconsistencies we may have. So we're really using that to try to get proposers back on an even playing field. It's best practice for it. But then ultimately we are awarding the RFP to the most advantageous proposer or proposers if it's a multiple award opportunity. So for strengths and weaknesses, we have some information here about what those are. Your strengths are going to be things that are exceeding requirements of the RFP. The requirements, when we're using that term, these are mandatory requirements. Just meeting a mandatory requirement is not a strength. That was kind of, you had to meet that to get in the door. But meeting or exceeding a desirable specification is strength, and those are mainly where we're looking for. So if we said we really want this, you know, maybe we really want blue carpet, and you offer us blue carpet, we can document that as a strength of your proposal. Weaknesses, on the other hand, are where there's not meeting the RFP requirements. Depending on how the RFP was written, this could also, not meeting the requirements could also be a disqualification issue there as well. But sometimes there's some wiggle room in how the RFP was worded to where they just become strengths, or not strengths, weaknesses. The other place we see lots of weaknesses are going to be where there were either no answers or lack of detailed information about one of our desirable specifications. Sufficient detail. Okay. These next few slides will focus on OSP's role when it comes to the RFP process. So broken out kind of by the process that we saw earlier. Starting with the agency scope of work, OSP's role as it comes to that document is to review the document for clarity and completeness. And really we have an eye towards ensuring maximum competition there as well. So we're looking to make sure, see if we get a hint that maybe we've tailored this scope of work inadvertently towards a particular group of proposers, and we really need to kind of step that back and make it more open to everyone. Mainly, the main way we do this is try and put ourselves in the potential proposer's shoes as we're reading that scope of work. When it comes to the remainder of those RFP documents that we talked about earlier, terms and conditions, evaluation documents, sample contract, our role there is to really be a guide in informing agencies about what the best practices are when it comes to RFPs. We also have a large focus on those documents with the evaluation criteria, so discussing with the agencies based on our experience, what has worked in the past, what are some things we should look at, what are things that maybe don't serve any value in the evaluation, and kind of assisting the agency with developing those. For publication, OSP publishes the RFP. We also handle all of the advertisement and other notices that need to go out. We review the answers to the questions that were submitted by the suppliers. So the agency will answer those questions, and state procurement reviews those answers to make sure they're complete to the best of the agency and state's knowledge. We also receive the proposals on behalf of the agency. So all the proposals will come to state procurement before they're dispersed out back to the agency for evaluation. When it comes to the evaluation, we have a very strong supportive role for the evaluation committee. We provide anything they may need. We're there as subject matter experts in procurement, not necessarily what is being procured, well, not at all what is being procured. That is the agency's role to be the subject matter expert there. But we use our experience and knowledge in RFPs themselves to help support and guide the committee. We also lead the consensus evaluation meeting. This involves keeping everybody on time and focused, as well as making sure that the document or the evaluation is consistent and fair to all parties. We also review the evaluation documentation. These are the strengths and weaknesses and the documented point scores. When we do that, we're making sure that they're consistent across all the proposals, again, just in case anything leaked through from the meeting. And we also make sure that the evaluation was done in line with the RFP, so that we're not evaluating things that we didn't say we were going to evaluate in our RFP. Final role, really, with the evaluation is state procurement concurs in the award recommendation from the agency. And that's done based on our review of the documentation. When it comes to negotiation, we also support the agency there. Mentioned earlier, that's based on the agency's ask. So if they run into any spots, trouble spots in the negotiation, we're certainly there to assist and help them with that. When it comes to the contract, we're reviewing the contract language. That's probably where most people would think our main role is for the contract. But we also have to verify the additional documentation. So Jonathan mentioned statutes that deal with contract approval. There's a large list of things beyond just the contract itself that must be present in order to approve the contract. I have kind of the main three that we're looking at here, but there's a lot more. Those being Secretary of State registration, federal clearance, making sure this isn't a company that the federal government has debarred, and then ensuring that the company has the insurance that was required in the RFP. So we have to verify all those. We're also checking that the people who've signed the contract actually have the authority to sign the contract. We're checking bonds, if there were bonds that were required, and a whole host of other things depending on what type of contract it is. We also approve the contract, ultimately. We're aware of that once we've checked everything. And then we also receive and review contract performance evaluations at the end of the contract. This is mainly for those PPCS contracts, but there is a requirement for the agency to create and submit a contract performance evaluation.
All right, so one topic that is very likely to be of interest to this group, because it comes up commonly in relation to RFPs, but can come up for any procurement, is protests. That's no doubt a familiar word. The procurement code authorizes protests by any aggrieved person. So you don't have to be the losing bidder in order to protest. You can be any aggrieved person saying that an award of a contract aggrieves you in any way. As a result of that, I've added a couple of notes here indicating there's currently no disincentive to protest. There's no reason not to protest. There's no protest bond. There's no, they have nothing to lose by submitting a protest. And so I say all that to emphasize that a protested award is not necessarily indicative of a flaw in a procurement. I could even go further to say that it's not indicative of a flaw in the procurement. The presence of a protest means that it's been protested, not that there's grounds for a protest necessarily. So I say that because for this audience, I want y'all to be aware that you're going to hear cases like such and such agency and OSP awarded a contract to vendor A, but the award was protested. To a layperson, that means that there's a fatal flaw that has yet to be executed, has yet to be resolved in it, and that's not necessarily the case. The protest process, unfortunately, it can be availed by anybody, and so there are slowdowns associated with that. No doubt there are valid protests that arise from time to time. Just wanted y'all to be aware that it's not necessarily indicative of a flaw. So there are two types of protests, protest of the solicitation and protest of the award. So protest of the solicitation is the less common format. This happens during the procurement, while the procurement's still in motion, at least 2 days before the procurement closes, and they say, look, we've seen your specifications, we've seen your requirements for what the winning proposer must offer, and we believe that your document is tilted in the direction of our competitor, and this is why. And they can make a good faith argument that we are either intentionally or unintentionally limiting competition, and if that's the case, we definitely will revisit the language, make any clarifications that are needed, and hopefully cure it before it gets further down in the process. The protest of the award, on the other hand, is the more common case. This happens after the competitive procurement has closed. We've announced our intention. We think vendor A should receive the award, and there's more varied claims that can go associated. They can say, we think that we were unfairly disqualified. We think that the other company was unfairly qualified. You know, if you knew what I knew about our competition, you wouldn't have picked them. We think if you had paid more attention to this paragraph and paid less attention to that other paragraph, you would see our perspective. So there's, just as, you know, as I mentioned before, there are valid protests, there are invalid protests, and they can be for multiple different ranges of items. The protest procedure is that a protest is received. Once that protest is received, there is a stay of an award. That's issued by the Office of State Procurement. The agency is given an opportunity to respond to the protest on the merits. For example, the agency points out the strengths of the award that the agency has recommended, as well as if there are any logical flaws or inconsistencies in the protest. Maybe the protestor only saw half the story, and the agency can clarify the situation. The Office of State Procurement's role in the protest is to look at that initial protest, look at the response by the agency, look at any supplemental documentation or any following correspondence, and make a decision about which party should prevail and whether the award should be upheld or not.
Okay. So we'll move now to some other methods of procurement that are available. And we'll start with the kind of broad category of PPCS contracts. These are service contracts. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, generally when you hear the word contract, it's going to be referring to one of these. A lot of these, I guess we'll go category by category as far as non-competitiveness in each one. But the first P stands for professional services. These are your doctors, lawyers, accountants. There's a list that is written into statute as far as what is considered a professional service. And these contracts are non-competitive regardless of dollar amount. So the idea being that they're providing this professional service, that it's unique to the specific person maybe, so that everything's going to be non-competitive there. It's also limited as far as who's in it. Personal services, the next category. These are really, think of it like artists, but also interpreters, musicians, writers. Really gets into kind of what I mentioned with the professionals, but that these are services that only that single person can provide, if you think of it that way. So an artist is the only person who can paint a picture done by them. So these are also non-competitive regardless of dollar amount. Our next category is consulting services. This is a much broader category. It's also a lot of gray area and overlap between some non-PPCS service contracting, which we'd consider to be done on the purchasing side of state procurement. So we're constantly looking at these, classify, is it consulting or is it not? But these consulting contracts below $75,000 per year are non-competitive. Above $75,000 per year, for the longest time until this past year, they had to be done as an RFP. In the past, most recent legislative session, agencies can now use cooperative contracts as well as reverse auctions for consulting services. Social services are contracts that are designed to benefit the general public in Louisiana. So these are contracts that are supporting citizens. Things such as, we see here, rehabilitation services, mental health, substance abuse, family planning. It can even go further than that because these are health things that we're looking at. A lot of the supportive services for recently released inmates also fall under social services as well. So it's just the state spending money for its citizens almost directly there. So what a social service is going to be. These are very narrowly defined. It's kind of similar to the professional service and personal services. So along with that, they come along with a higher threshold for where competition is needed. So they are non-competitive for less than $250,000 per year, and anything above that amount requires the RFP.
As Austin articulated, the consulting services is the grayest area of the four, and so in practice, anything which can't clearly be defined as a professional, personal, social, or purchasing contract winds up falling into the consulting category. So in addition to the defined categories which go into consulting, consulting can also be thought of as a category of last resort, which is appropriate because it also has the most restrictive competition requirement. You see everything over $75,000 a year must be bid out. They don't get the benefit of the no competition in the defined other categories.
Another procurement method is cooperative purchasing. These are various organizations that combine their spending power to issue contracts similar to our statewide contracts, just at a higher level with multiple state entities or other public procurement entities. We can also use the federal GSA schedules to convert them into a state procurement mechanism as well. We'll have a lot more detail on that in the following slides. We also have brand name contracting. These are done through solicitation, so there is some competition there, but it is those solicitations are limited to a specific brand, such as, I believe, your John Deere contracts, things like that. So it'll be a solicitation specific to whatever brand it is. With all of these, we have multiple different brands. So I don't think we do this through brand names anymore, but the copier contracts, for instance, we have Xerox. We'd have a Xerox bid. We could have a Canon bid, Kyocera, for instance. All those would be brand name contracting. With those, we also will put the lapse rule on the contracts as well, which requires agencies to take a second step of competition where they have to compare the brand name contracts before they go with any specific one.
In case anybody's wondering why we would ever have a procurement where we specify on the front end what the make or the brand is, just know that's not the typical case. Usually, I'd say 95% of all procurements, if not more, if we're specifying a make or model, it's on an or equal basis, saying, we want, a solution that is equivalent to this. So we might say we want the equivalent of a Ford Taurus, just so that everybody knows what we're talking about. We're not looking for a Dodge Ram when we say that. We're looking for a Kia Optima to go up against that. With brand name contracting, the reason why we might specify the make is for continuity. So maybe the Department of Revenue has 99 Kyocera copiers and they need one more copier. Obviously, there would be economies of scale lost if that 100th copier were a Konica Minolta or something like that. They need the ability to preserve continuity, to harness economies of scale. So it's relatively narrow categories where they are given the opportunity to procure in that way.
And then we also have emergency procurements. These will fall, I think we also have some additional detail, but it usually falls into two types. Your kind of one-off emergencies where maybe a water pipe burst in your facility and everything's being flooded, so you need to hurry up and get somebody in here to fix it. And second category being kind of natural disasters or coronavirus, as we see. Those are going to be governor-declared emergencies.
All right, so we're going to get into cooperative purchasing to build on what Austin mentioned about cooperative purchasing. So these are contracts benefiting multiple public bodies. They're authorized by RS 39-1702, as I mentioned. They typically involve national organizations. So you may have heard of WISCA or NASCO Value Point or Omnia Partners, or there's a variety of these different organizations that exist out there. And their goal is to harness together the buying power of multiple public bodies to deliver benefits to all of them. So perhaps the most high-profile one that you've heard about is likely Medicaid. A couple of states are working on national solutions for the Medicaid modules. So y'all may be familiar with the idea that Medicaid over time has become more modularized. It used to be you'd have one solution for all of Medicaid, and now you have a different solution for provider management versus enrollment versus the different functions of Medicaid. And so the states are working on a team approach to come up with one solution that would be workable for dozens of states, with a focus on not reinventing the wheel, focusing on the value-added needs. Of course, this harnesses economies of scale. It also offers trickle-down benefits. Louisiana, in the grand scheme of things, is a smaller state and a poorer state. And so if we can multiply our buying power by, coordinating our efforts with Texas, Florida, or, other states that are in roughly similar situations, that's good not only for us, but it's also good for those other states. There's no state that is so big that they don't benefit from having the additional buying power that Louisiana brings to the table. With that, we also, of course, get the benefit of additional or better cost, availability, and service. And as you'll see, these benefits flow in both directions. So cooperative purchasing is not only a matter of the flow down from these national organizations like the NASCO Value Point, Omnia Partners, Sourcewell, to the state of Louisiana. It's also from the state of Louisiana down to our users. So whenever the city of New Orleans, to go back to the example I used, the city of New Orleans is a political subdivision of the state. By default, they are subject to Title 38. They can do their own procurement. They don't have to come through OSP by any means, but they have the ability to opt into the use of statewide contracts. So for the same reasons that we might participate in cooperative purchasing, the city of New Orleans might. They might wisely say, our challenge at the city of New Orleans is pumps. We want to focus on, getting pumps right. We're not going to expend a lot of energy on office supplies. We're going to use the state's office supply contract. That's from my perspective, that's a good decision. And that's something that cooperative purchasing allows them and all other state agencies, political subdivisions, quasi-agencies, and universities to do. They can make use of statewide contracts, and of course, in creating those statewide contracts, OSP can make use of these national contracts. So, for example, there may be cases where Louisiana can get, strong, pricing and terms and conditions on its own, but then there are going to be other cases like office supplies where we deliver a better result for all of our users by coordinating our efforts with other states, other municipalities, et cetera.
Now we'll get into emergency procurements, which Austin kind of touched on a few minutes ago. In regards to emergency procurements, the Office of State Procurement's mission is to assist and support agencies through these events. The OSP actually activated its Emergency Operations Center personnel since March of 2020 to assist with the pandemic. And all OSP staff are considered essential personnel, and that is a condition of their appointment. We want them to be ready, available, and willing to assist through any of the disasters or emergency events. And as previously mentioned, the staff are ready to assist year-round, not just during hurricane season, and not only for just Gulf storms that may occur. The two types of emergencies are the usual ones, as mentioned, facility issues, equipment issues, and also catastrophic emergencies. They have the obvious differences, but basically we take the same approach at assisting on each of these. Also, the authority for emergency procurements are through two different ways. First would be per revised statute 39-1598, which gives the chief procurement officer or his or her designee the level of procurement officer may make or authorize others to make emergency procurements when there are imminent threats to public health, welfare, safety, public property under emergency conditions as defined in accordance with regulations, as well as through the government proclamations or executive orders. These are especially useful in order to kind of relax some of the administrative logistics and formalities when making certain purchases. Existing statutory authorization make procurements less reliant than some processes of government and executive proclamations and orders.
So when there's an emergency situation, our procurements change. Our goals kind of change as well. Really, we're focused on speed more than our normal situation where it's doing it. Speed isn't necessarily at our top list of priorities. Okay. So we need an immediate response. There's an emergency situation. So we're not doing a 21-day bid, for instance, or a 30-day RFP. We need to get a response immediately. This generally means we're going to the quote method, which we'll get into a little bit later. It's because the stakes are higher, people are being harmed, or property is being harmed, depending on which type of an emergency it is. We also don't always get a clear picture. A lot of what you're doing in an emergency is kind of building a puzzle from, think of like maybe 5 different puzzles. Somebody just dumped all 5 puzzle pieces on your table, and you're trying to like sort out what goes where. We have to keep a clear head during these emergencies and make sure that we're still doing the right thing as it comes to from procurement perspective. Okay. We do this with less competition than we normally have because many, especially with a catastrophic emergency, a lot of businesses aren't open. So we have a smaller core of suppliers. We also actively seek suppliers that are available during emergencies for what we call resource lists. Just so we know who's available, who's there. Logistics are a challenge because things close down. I know with the floods, we had a big issue because we had contract for porta potties in Hammond, and we needed them in Baton Rouge, and I-12 was completely flooded. So how do you get those porta potties to Baton Rouge in that situation? So it's a lot of what you're being able to adapt and change on the fly at a second's notice. In that instance, we had to immediately pivot and start trying to look for porta potties to the west of us, because at that point, you could still get to Baton Rouge. The funding source usually changes. Again, this is with catastrophic emergencies. that's when FEMA kicks in, so it's usually federal funding. So we have a whole new rule set that comes in that we have to follow to make sure that we get that federal reimbursement. Okay. So there's lots of challenges when it comes to emergency procurements, but we still, we have to keep our focus there. The three main agencies that we're supporting when it comes to the emergencies are going to be GOSEP, LDH, and DCFS. We help them essentially with all of their procurement needs, whatever they need. They have more pressing, important matters that they are directly responsible for. So they tell us what their needs are. We go try to find it as quickly and as efficiently as we can and get it to them so that they can perform their emergency functions. We do a lot of close work with our supplier community. It seems like every emergency we find a new company out there who can get us everything that we need at a good price. So we're working very closely with them in an emergency situation. We need to make sure that we are complying with all of our regulations, because even though it is an emergency, we still have the responsibility of making sure we're good stewards of public funds. And that goes into making sure that we get those reimbursements from FEMA, from the federal partners as well. So we need to make sure we are following all of the rules that need to be followed. Okay. As I mentioned with some of those challenges, you have to be flexible when there's an emergency. We get partial information. Generally, the end users are very flustered when it comes to an emergency. They're being pulled in 1,000 different directions. They can't always necessarily give us the information. So we have to do a lot of reading between the lines, a lot of direct questions to make sure that we're getting them exactly what they need. With that flexibility, though, we do need to make sure we're complying with the FEMA rules. Generally, the federal rule is that you have to go with the most stringent set of laws or rules that you have. Generally, that's going to be our state rules, but in a declared emergency, those are relaxed from where we generally operate. The governor will waive strict adherence with the procurement code in his emergency proclamation. That doesn't mean that the entire, that we just throw out everything we know and we just find somebody and get it. Generally, that means we're following kind of the thought processes that are inherent in the small purchase executive order. So we're seeking at least 3 quotes. We usually try to get as many as we can, but with all of these emergency procurements, there's also a time frame. So we're trying to get as many quotes as we can in the time frame that we need to cut. Generally maybe it's an hour, 2 hours, depending on the equipment that we're trying to find. Sometimes it can be half a day, but if we only get 1 quote in that time and we need to pull the trigger on a PO, we have the flexibility to do that with the relaxation of the regulations. Doing this makes it more likely that we are reimbursed by FEMA. And again, that flexibility only applies for what is needed to directly respond to the emergency. So even though the governor, we've actually had relaxation of the procurement code for like 18 months now since coronavirus first really hit. But you can only use that relaxation for things that are directly responding to the coronavirus pandemic in that situation. When a hurricane hits, you can't go out and buy a fleet of vehicles without following any of the procurement code just because the governor's proclamation. You can only purchase things at a relaxed level that are directly responding to that hurricane. Okay. So clearly there's trade-offs here. We know that we're not, how do I put this? With these informal mechanisms, we know we're kind of flipping our standard goals in a non-emergency situation of just deep dive and ensuring that we're the good stewards of that public till that we are, going with low cost and all that. It kind of tilts more towards, we need this, we need it now type situations. And we try to get it at the most competition and the best price that we can, but that's not always possible with the time frames we're working in. Yeah. So we strive to have a mechanism that we're following, a procedure that we're following to ensure that we're getting as close to what our standard goals are as possible, but knowing that sometimes we just have to get it done. And that comes with, we don't want anybody, whether it's legislative auditors or FEMA auditors or general public or even our internal auditors coming to us and believing that we abused our authority in the emergency. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're responding to the needs while still doing it right.
Additional methods that we have during the emergency are emergency contingency contracts. So there's over 100 standing emergency contracts that we have that are available to activate. When all goes well, these are contracts that are established and then are never used for their 1, 2, or 3 year lifespan. They cover a wide range of services. It can be MREs, bulk ice, refrigerated trucks, bottled water, et cetera. They're bid out long in advance of hurricane season, long before they're needed, again with the hope that they never will be needed. But they provide pre-negotiated pricing and priority access. So, for example, we're putting this vendor on notice that, hey, if a hurricane hits those porta potties that we have under contract with you, the state of Louisiana has first rights on those. You have to check with us before making them available to anybody else. We update our contracts with lessons learned. So maybe, for example, we learned during Katrina that bulk ice, wasn't as helpful as we thought it was going to be. Or maybe we learned, hey, it would have been really nice to have a catalog contract for heavy equipment rental, where we're not just confined to 5 different line items, but we can rent anything that United Rentals or Sunbelt has in their inventory. One of the pros of emergency contingency contracts, we have lower pricing, we don't have to scramble. The cons, I don't know if it's really a con, but that's how I described it. They are bid during the off-season, so obviously some vendors aren't watching at that time. We would be behind the 8 ball if we waited for a storm to be in the Gulf before we established this contract. So that there's, as Austin quite well put it, there is a trade-off, but we balance that trade-off in favor of planning ahead, doing our due diligence before the need exists. We also use existing statewide contracts as much as possible. If we can avoid doing a rapid quote using existing contracts, we definitely do. Advantages are, of course, pricing, compliance documentation, and familiar vendors. If the office supply vendor is able to fulfill during a hurricane or during a pandemic, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, that's a good thing. As Austin mentioned, though, there are some unique challenges to catastrophic events such as logistics. Some vendors may not be able to get past the National Guard roadblocks. Some can, but some won't be able to. And some emergency needs, of course, are just not on regular contracts. 2 of the familiar emergency methods that we use to navigate emergencies are requests for quotations. So it's an abbreviated invitation to bid process that we introduced for COVID. All registered vendors in our system, which we're going to get into shortly, receive a notification. It's a balancing act between the regular bid process and the 3 quotes process that we're going to describe shortly. It's medium speed, gives more transparency and more competition. It builds on existing registrations so that everybody can see what's happening. And we're constantly adding providers to our resource list and encouraging providers to sign up in LPAC, which we're going to get into shortly. We have the ability to tailor how long the bid is out there. instead of a 21-day bid, it may be a 6-hour bid. Give us your best price in 6 hours, or 24 hours, whatever the case may be. The 3 quotes process is the more familiar, more long-standing bid process in emergency procurements. It is the minimum level of competition. It's built for speed over transparency, but it's, as Austin articulated, it's a product of its environment. Sometimes you need the goods and services primarily, and you're not maximizing competition, you're maximizing delivery. The stakes are too high to quibble over, $1 here or a few cents there. So in the 3 quotes process, 3 vendors are contacted individually, asked for their pricing. Award can be immediate. There are, of course, trade-offs associated with narrowed visibility and the timeline. There may be vendors who could participate, but if they aren't contacted, obviously they wouldn't be able to, which is why we generally prefer the request for quotations process. And indeed, Representative Lyons asked us a year or 2 ago with HCR 31 to use the RFQ process as much as possible over the 3 quotes process. Considerations that go into this, and again, this is tailored for this audience because this is something that comes up often. Austin mentioned the greater role of federal funding requirements. One of those federal requirements is in the CFR, 2 CFR 200-319, which says that the state cannot impose local geographic preferences in its procurements. Essentially, that non-compliant procurements are excluded from federal funding. As a result, we do not have the ability to say that anybody responding to this bid must be a Louisiana-based company. To my knowledge, there's nothing in state law that prohibits that, but as soon as you did that, you would run afoul of the federal regulation, as well as possibly the U.S. Constitution on equal protection. But certainly the federal funding requirement would create a problem in the emergency environment. Additionally, there are reciprocal geographic preferences. Ours exist in 1604.5, which says that any preference that the state applies against foreign companies can be applied against Louisiana companies when working in those states. So, for example, if we give a leg up to Louisiana-based companies over Florida-based companies without passing any other law, Florida could apply the same advantage for their local companies to the detriment of Louisiana companies. And that's something many states have to try to avoid parochial laws. Intentionally reducing competition, this is carried over from a previous question. It's a common question we get about, can we increase economic development locally by excluding non-local companies? And our response would be that not only are you going to see increased costs because there are fewer bidders, but those fewer bidders know that there are fewer bidders, and they have less incentive to sharpen their pencils. So you would expect to see a dynamic cost increase associated with that.
So we've kind of focused on what OSP's role is in the emergency space. But we want to go through that many of the areas where your members may be getting lots of questions from don't actually come through state procurement. So this will be here if it's transportation or evacuation of really pets or the people. DOTD handles that as part of ESF 1. We are involved in setting up the contract, but the actual performance of the contract itself does not come through us at all. DOTD doesn't come to us and say we need to activate this contract or anything. They just go out and do the work. Okay. For the road debris clearing, it's part of ESF 3. Jonathan and I actually kind of discussed that this morning, and we're not even sure which procurement code they're using to do that. We have an idea that it's probably 38, but that's also DOTD and CPRA. That doesn't come through OSP at all. We never see anything related to road debris and clearing.
Even though those are probably the most contentious emergency contracts that you hear about.
Yeah. Sheltering and food of citizens, that's ESF 6. That's even not done at a state level. That's handled by FEMA and the Red Cross. So that's another one that's very contentious that the state's not actually involved in. And then for your medical and health needs, the shelters and all of that you hear about, as part of ESF 8, those are handled exclusively by LDH. While we do support LDH in an emergency capacity, we're not supporting them with these medical and health needs. So that would be where those kind of questions would need to be directed to.
Ending the discussion on emergency contracts for now, we're going to return to a broader discussion of general methods of procurement. Next up, we've touched on these statewide contracts. You'll sometimes also hear them referred to as 44 contracts because they're the two initial digits in a typical contract. Often prospective vendors will be asked if you have a state contract. Statewide contracts are established by OSP to meet the needs of all state agencies as well as political subdivisions and quasi-agencies of the state. I'll pause here to clarify that a quasi-agency, as we use it, is a non-governmental entity performing a governmental function using governmental funds. So probably the best example I can think of is like a charter school. It's not a public entity, but it is performing a public function using public funds. As a result, it is eligible to use statewide contracts because any efficiencies harnessed by that charter school, is to the benefit of the state, ultimately. Statewide contracts are typically established by the invitation to bid, request for proposal, Federal General Services Administration contract, or cooperatives. So we've touched on all four of those methods so far. All four of those can lead into statewide contracts. As I mentioned, there's the benefit of bundled buying power and compliance. Emergency contingency contracts I've talked about, like the MREs, et cetera, are often a subset of statewide contracts. Some of them are agency-specific, others are, or most of them are for all agencies and political subdivisions, et cetera.
Okay. So this diagram kind of is a good visual for how procurement in the state kind of operates. In the center we have Office of State Procurement, and you can see there's some overlapping here as well. We'll focus first on the green circle with most state agencies. You can see there's a heavy overlap there. Most of what state agencies are procuring falls within state procurement sphere. So we have to review it, approve it. Depending on what type of procurement it is, we have to actually do the procurement for that agency as well. There's very limited items that the agencies can do on their own. Yeah. That expands when it comes to statewide elected officials. They generally have a little bit higher autonomy. Moving down for construction, there's very little construction that's done within state procurement sphere. We have FP&C and DOTD highways here inside the circle. We actually don't do any of the work for them, but construction as a whole, if you would think about it, we call it labor and materials, but we do handle smaller construction projects like that, whether it's replacing a chiller, repaving a sidewalk or a parking lot, potentially, although depending on the size, that could also take it out of state procurement's wheelhouse. But smaller projects like that, fixing decks is something traditionally we've done in state parks, and things like that as far as construction sphere.
So, and also some like-for-like replacement. So if you have like a 100 square foot utility shed that gets blown over in a tornado, and they just want to buy a replacement ready-made equipment shed, that could be something that could go through the procurement code rather than going through Title 38 and facility planning.
Yeah. When it comes to higher ed and political subdivisions, quasi-agencies, they are operating on their own, but they can use our statewide contracts, as we just mentioned. So that's voluntary on their part. Any kind of edicts passed down, we can make some things mandatory. I don't think we currently have any mandatory contracts, but if we were to make something mandatory as it applied to higher ed and political subdivisions, they would not have to follow that rule.
So how are contracts created? It starts with the recurring needs for agencies. And of course, we anticipate that 99+% of existing recurring needs are covered by statewide contracts, but we're on the lookout for them. So of course, many of these needs are universal in nature, office supplies and computers, for example. Most agencies need janitorial supplies, copiers, things like that. Going down the list, relatively few agencies need ammunition or herbicides, and then only one agency, maybe two agencies, purchase tobacco tax stamps or school buses. Again, just to indicate that there are the universal to the rare needs. What I am proud to report to you is that literally all of these and many other needs are covered by statewide contracts. So we establish these contracts, and they're for the benefit of all agencies. So, for example, even though relatively few state agencies purchase school buses, there are 68 school districts around the state that do, and they can all make use of our school bus contracts. We, of course, are responsive to agency requests on both the purchasing and the technical/professional services side. So if they say, hey, we could really use, a real-life example was we could really use telephonic interpretation. We want somebody to be able to call the Medicaid enrollment line and press, a number for any language in the world, not being nailed down to Spanish or Vietnamese or French, as the case was. We can do that. We created a contract. We look at repetitive retail purchases. What are people buying with their P card? Is there a trend there that we could capitalize on to return value and diminish that rogue spend? We actually look at that emergency contingency contracts. Every once in a while, an agency will say, hey, this bottled water contract that y'all had during an emergency was really helpful. It'd be nice if y'all could make it available year-round. That's something we would consider.
And next, we'll get into some of the state systems that can be utilized for various types of information. We'll start off with the Office of State Procurement's website, procurement.la.gov. It actually recently went through a revamp. We try to provide as much information to state agencies, vendors, and whomever else who may want to do things, get into contracts and such with the state. Next would be LaGov, LaPac, which is where vendor registration occurs. There's also bid postings, bid notifications, and listing of registered vendors, as well as ECAT, which is the state's electronic catalog of existing contracts, which can be utilized to search and see the various contracts we have. You could do a search based on a vendor, commodity codes, various type of searching items to find what you're looking for there. And next would be the link on LED's website for small business programs, the Hudson Initiative, which was kind of mentioned before, which will help small businesses get registered to do business with the state as well.
So this is a screenshot of our website, procurement.la.gov. We have various tiles for the depending on what you're looking for, agency resources, vendor resources, and then training resources, depending on what you're looking to find. Okay. We'll focus here, we mentioned very early on, it's from kind of a vendor's perspective, because generally they'll be contacting you, maybe they need help for how to register. So by clicking on vendor resources on the previous screen, you'll come in to our vendor section, and right up at the top left, right up front, is the link to register as a vendor with the state. Zelensky mentioned the LAPAC vendor registration. This registering with the state gets you into the list. You are able to choose the commodities or services that you provide as a business, and then anytime the state, as well as many political subdivisions, post a bid to LAPAC, you get automatic notification of that opportunity if it falls within what you do as a business based on that commodity or service code that you selected.
So on LAPAC, whenever a vendor clicks through, this is the screen they're going to see on LAPAC. Notably, there is an option to select the vendor registration menu. Also, as we'll talk about shortly, they can view bids by category, by department. If they happen to have a bid number, they can look for it that way. They can also check the status of any existing solicitations that have opened. But with the vendor registration menus particularly, they can click through, and again, for every screen, there's multiple sub-options to support them. So in addition to the enrollment portal, which is what most people will select, they can choose to maintain an existing registration. They can look up their UNSPSC code. All you need to know about the UNSPSC code, you don't have to know what it stands for. It's just that it, as Austin described, it's just a commodity code. Most business owners will know what their NAICS code is, the North America Industry Classification System code. The UNSPSC code is very similar to that. So, for example, if you're a concrete cutting company, you're going to know that your NAICS code is 238990, and there can be a similar code for UNSPSC code. And as Austin indicated, the benefit of that is whenever they self-identify that way, whenever we go out to bid for a service like that, we select the code, and everybody that's identified that way receives a notification. So for benefits of registration, number one is the automated bid notifications, as we just described, free enrollment, 24/7 access, self-enrollment. It certainly makes the company visible to agencies, even for non-competitive procurements. It ties into the payment system, so in addition to winning the work, but also getting paid for the work, they want to make sure they're registered. And it allows online responses to bid instead of submitting paper. And of course, it is required for any contract awards. So the number one thing we would say, the number one thing that we would recommend the legislature say is, for any business that wants to get plugged into doing business with the state, step one is registering. It's free, it's easy. It literally can be done in 20 minutes. And from there, they really are in. They'll get the emails whenever a bid opportunity for that category goes out. And it's a huge single first step that they can take to really prime themselves for later success.
Okay. We also have many help scripts to walk the vendors through the registration process. Jonathan mentioned that it is very easy, but just in case somebody runs into some issues, we have these help documents on our website as well, in that vendor, used to be called the vendor portal. I think we changed the name when we revamped our website. Going back to LAPAC, this is the kind of intermediate screen. If you click on bids by department, the top of LAPAC, it shows state procurement, number one. Generally, always, I've never seen it be anywhere or another agency have close to the number of bids that are at state procurement level. But it also breaks down into individual state agencies that have the authority to place their own bids, or maybe these are some of the consulting contract RFPs or some other things where they have their own autonomy. You'll see transportation development here has 21 of its posted. I wager that most of those were probably Title 48 roads and bridges procurements. In addition, here where it says state on the left, you can see with state agencies, As you scroll down, there's a long list like City of Baton Rouge, Post Tulipac, a lot of universities publish Tulipac. So beyond just state agencies, it's a large resource for public procurements as well.
One thing I would point out here is typically, this would not be what I would recommend vendors use, because most often vendors don't care who the agency is. Unless they're aware of a specific opportunity, like unless they heard through the grapevine that Ag and Forestry just posted a bid, they probably are agnostic. They'll do business for anybody. The reason why we point this out to you all is it may be much more likely that a particular member would have an interest in an agency. So, for example, if your member is on criminal justice, for example, maybe he's interested to see what contracts the Department of Corrections is putting out. And of course, there's multiple other pairings like that could go out. So not only is this a competition resource, it's also a transparency resource.
You can also check for bids by category. That's the UNSPSC codes. We have them broken out at the very top level. So this is a way to find all the bids within each of these categories by clicking the link. So if you're a cleaning supply company and you haven't necessarily registered in those commodity codes, you can come search for bids by category, click on cleaning equipment and supplies. You'll see there are 14 bids at the time this screenshot was done, and you'll see all 14 of those listed there, regardless of agency. So it's probably a better resource for vendors that way. Once you click through to see the actual bids, no matter which way you're going, this is the screen that you see listing the bids with their bid number in the far left. There's a description along with the attachments for the terms and conditions of that bid. You have the date that it opens, date that the deadline to submit a response, as well as some help information there. Clicking on that will give you the phone number for the office that issued the bid.
And next we'll get into the strategies for vendor success. Some of these were mentioned on a couple previous slides by Jonathan. One would be to offer a solution. The next thing would be for the vendor to obviously register to receive the communications regarding certain projects out for bid. They must compete and market themselves, their services and offerings. Take advantage of the low-hanging fruit, which would be the non-competitive purchases and contracts. Get involved or get an understanding if they qualify for the Hudson Initiative, and get registered with that as well for purchases up to $30,000. And they would receive points for RFP proposals as a subcontractor or as a prime. And then also they could partner with other vendors for certain projects that may be offered. Next is outreach and accountability. The Commissioner's Agency Hudson participation goals, become a Hudson contractor, as well as will provide a good faith follow-up. There's also Louisiana Checkbook, where they can where there's plenty of information in regards to projects and contracts that we have out there. The integration potentially of the USP DBE database with LeGov. Also potential expansion of the agency DBE participation. And then also vendor demographics reporting.
And so these steps together are efforts that have been championed by Governor Edwards and carried out by Commissioner Darden, of course with our participation, our assistance, to make sure that we are maximizing the participation by local small businesses, and where resources exist, where preferences already exist in law outside of the procurement code for DBEs and things like that. We're just making sure that we are maximizing whatever lawful avenues already exist, so that there's a clear picture.
Next would be the vendor guide, which would offer detailed explanation of vendor registration portion. It'll dive deeper into registration, contracting, and customer service processes. This could be found on the procurement website. You go to Vendor Center, Publications, and then Vendor Guide. It could be downloaded and saved and referred back to in regards to those steps. And the training center resources found alongside that would be information on contract management, general procurement, LeGov, legislation, professional contracts, purchasing, various resources, RFPs, travel, and vendor trainings as well.
Contact information for Austin and Zielinski is here, as well as for Paula, the Director of the State Chief Procurement Officer. Y'all likely already have my contact information, but we're going to go ahead and shift into a Q&A status. So using the chat, or if y'all want to unmute and ask any questions that come up, we are happy to go back to any slides, as well as anything that we didn't cover, at least didn't cover adequately. Definitely glad to go into a robust Q&A so that any of y'all's questions can be answered. Are there any questions? All right. Hearing no questions, again, we'll hang out for a second in case there's any questions. We'll send out a link to the video. We hope that this will be an ongoing resource. Again, I would recommend, I'll pull up the contact information one more time. These will be your primary points of contact for the Office of State Procurement. Austin is primary for legislation and backup for budget. Zielinski is primary for budget and backup for legislation. The two of them work really well and closely together. So they'll be your ongoing points of contact. And then, of course, Paula is a subject matter expert for everything OSP related, including legislation and budget. So we'll share this link for the video. Please feel free to share it widely as needed. Otherwise, we appreciate your time. Thank you for listening. Hope you've learned something. And please stay in touch. Please let us know how the Office of State Procurement can help facilitate your success and that of your members and the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the presentation. That was very informative.
Thank you, Shane.